Randjbar-Daemi. This is going to take the form of a debate, if you like. So the way that we're going to structure it is to invite the two main speakers to speak each for about 30 minutes. Then each of them will have an opportunity to respond to what the other has said for a shorter period. And then I'm going to reach out into the audience to invite one or two others to make comments as they wish. And then at the end we'll have some questions from the generality of the audience within the time available. So there'll be a bit of a structure to it. I think many of you will know that beyond the already controversial nature of this question of the coup of 1953, new controversies have opened up in the last few years. And some of those revolve around these two people here, particularly perhaps Randjbar-Daemi. So it will be, I think, a lively session. Certainly has the potential to be a lively session. I'm reminded a little of what referees in old-fashioned British prize fighting used to say. Let's have a fair fight and no kicking or gouging. But I'm sure it won't come to that. What I think we should do, and I think Professor Abrahamian already said something like this in his talk, that as far as possible we should think about the facts and the evidence and logical interpretation of the evidence according to reason, rather than going into motivations or the motivations of individuals. I think that's what we should be trying to do. But I think it's going to be an excellent session, and let me begin it by inviting Professor GASIOROWSKI to come up to speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for that introduction, and thanks to Oliver and Siavush for inviting me. Oliver asked me to give an overview of the CIA's role in the 1953 coup, and so that's going to be the main focus of my talk. But of course, it wasn't just the CIA that did this from the American side, so I'm also going to add just a little bit about a few other important steps that other US government bodies were involved in. What I'm trying to do in this presentation is give a sense of the breadth with which the United States approached this coup, and the various levels and the many different kinds of things that the United States did to carry out the coup. And in a way, that's kind of my reply to Mr. Bayandor's book, that it wasn't just who organized the crowds. The US role in the coup was much bigger. My research, as many of you know, on this occurred mainly back in the mid-1980s, beginning when I was a grad student. And I came back to this issue around 2000 in preparation for the book that I published in 2004 with Malcolm Byrne, which has a series of articles by myself and Maziar Behruz and a few other people. But most of my work came in the mid-1980s. My work on the coup has been mainly from four main sources. First of all, the two well-known books by Donald Wilbur, and that's actually Internal CIA History, and the book by Kermit Roosevelt, both, of course, completely indispensable sources on the coup. Secondly, I spent a lot of time in the archives of the PRO in London and found a lot of juicy tidbits there. Thirdly, I spent a lot of time in the comparable US archives, the National Archives, then located in downtown Washington, now located out in the Washington suburbs. A lot of people have not looked at the National Archives on this sort of topic. And then finally, and most important, I did a great deal of work interviewing key participants, mainly in the 80s, but a few of them I came back to who were still alive around 2000. These interviews included interviews with 4 of the 5 CIA officers who were on the ground in Tehran and carried out the coup. And some of them I talked to repeatedly. 2 other CIA officers who were in Tehran at the time and were very peripherally involved, but not directly involved in the coup itself. 3 non-CIA members of the embassy team, 3 Foreign Service officers who were involved in the coup in rather peripheral ways. 3 CIA officers who were back at headquarters in Washington who played key roles in organizing and orchestrating the coup from Washington. 2 top U.S. officials who were deeply involved in this, the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, Henry Byrode, and also Richard Helms, who was, I think, head of covert operations or deputy head of covert operations in the CIA at the time. 3 British officials who were involved. And then finally, 1 key Iranian participant, Ardashir Zahedi, who I saw in 1983. So a lot of my knowledge of the coup is from these interviews. I was very careful. I had a lot of time back then. I wasn't married. I was just a grad student. So I spent a lot of time cross-checking what these different people said, you know, with among themselves, and also with the documentary material. There was extraordinary consistency in what they all said, with one exception, and that was Ardashir Zahedi, who told me a big pack of lies, frankly. So I discount everything he said, but the others, I never found any kind of contradictions of any seriousness. And so, you know, those interviews did an awful lot, not only to fill in the gaps, but to kind of cross-check and verify information I got from other sources. So, I'm not going to go through the coup detail by detail. Most of you know the story, I think, quite well, and it's out there as told in the works of various people, including myself. Rather, what I'm going to do to try to highlight the role, first of all, of the CIA in carrying out the coup, and then of other U.S. government agencies, I'm going to go through the actions that were crucial to the coup, sort of one at a time. So I'm going to begin by talking about 7 main sets of actions that the CIA carried out over a period of about 2 years that contributed to the overthrow of Mossadegh. And then I will talk about actions mainly by the State Department that also contributed. So first of all, and probably least important, but it's worth mentioning, is that for reasons that I was never entirely able to understand, the CIA had been carrying out some, I think probably rather minor covert operations in at least the year or so before the coup was even conceived. The U.S. government made the decision to do the coup in the period from February through, say, early April of 1953. Before February 1953, and very much contrary to something that Ervan said this morning, the U.S. government was not trying to undermine Mossadegh and had no covert operations with that intention. Rather, what the U.S. had in Iran before the decision was made to go forward with the coup was a large covert operation called TPB-DAM that had been set up around 1950-ish and evolved, and by 1952, 1953 had become a very large covert operation, probably comparable in size to ones that the United States was doing in Eastern Europe at the time and in parts of East Asia. The TPB-DAM covert operation, it's worth mentioning, I've just written an article about this that will be coming out very soon in the Journal of Cold War Studies. If anybody wants it, I'm happy to email you a copy. The TPB-DAM operation was an anti-communist, anti-Soviet, anti-Tudeh party covert operation. It was, which is what CIA was really enamored with at the time, a psychological warfare operation in the lingo of the era. This meant that it was mainly focused on carrying out propaganda activities in Iran, which meant doing things like inserting articles into Iranian newspapers that, you know, were meant to cause trouble in one way or another, publishing books on topics that would undermine the Soviet position in Iran, and other kinds of covert propaganda operations. So that was the main focus of TPB-DAM, but at the same time it also carried out what we could call covert political action through the TPB-DAM program. A fair amount of money was channeled to various Iranian groups like the Pan-Iranists, the Sumco Party, part of the Toilers Party, to clash in the streets with the Tudeh Party and, you know, on a physical basis, unlike propaganda, to try to counter the role of the Tudeh Party in Iran. So this was an anti-Soviet, anti-communist covert operation. By early 1953, it was quite large. There were at least 135 Iranians on the payroll of the TPB-DAM operation. The budget for it was something as much as $1 million, which was a great deal of money at the time, and actually a considerable amount of the CIA's entire covert operations budget. So it was a big operation because Iran was an important country right on the border of the Soviet Union, right after the Azerbaijan crisis had occurred, you know, so it was a great concern to the United States. Anyway, TPB-DAM had been set up before Mossadegh became prime minister and well before there began to be talk in Washington of carrying out a coup. For whatever reasons, at least in small ways, the TPB-DAM operation was used in ways that undermined the National Front. I think probably had a very minor effect, but for example, under the TPB-DAM operation, some of the propaganda was aimed at discrediting Ayatollah Khashoggi and creating divisions between him and Mossadegh. Under TPB-DAM, the CIA apparently gave money to Randjbar-Daemi, head of the Toilers Party, apparently with the intention of breaking him away from the National Front. So some things happened for reasons I don't entirely understand. Maybe the CIA officers who did this thought for some reason that there was an anti-Soviet angle in carrying out these actions. I never was able to find out why. My guess is that these actions had a very minor impact at this time before the U.S. began planning the coup. But I mentioned them just to put them on the table. So that was the first set of actions, again, well before the United States made the decision to go forward with a coup attempt. Secondly, the CIA played the lead role in making plans for the coup. This took place in May of 1953, after the U.S. government had decided in late March and early April to go forward with a coup. They decided, in conjunction with the British, to have a CIA contract employee who's well known to probably to most of you in this room, Donald Wilbur, who was a well-known academic, not a faculty member at Princeton, but lived in Princeton and an architectural historian, but longtime consultant to the CIA and a master propagandist within the CIA. Other CIA people described some of the things he did and they said he was just brilliant at doing propaganda. Anyway, he had been the key figure in the TPB-DAM operation, which its focus was propaganda. Its main focus, as I said, was propaganda. So Donald Wilbur was sent to Nicosia, Cyprus, to meet with a key British intelligence officer, Norman Derbyshire, and the two of them wrote up the initial plan for the coup. It had several elements, which I can describe briefly. First of all, the CIA would use the TPB-DAM program in all its capabilities and all of its 135 assets, switch the focus away from the Soviet Union to an all-out effort to undermine Mossadegh with propaganda and with covert political operations in the street. And this occurred, and this included things like trying to portray Mossadegh as being soft on communism, carrying out attacks on clerics and on mosques in the name of the Tudeh Party and other things of that sort. So this was to be an effort, and it was an effort, to sort of ratchet up the level of chaos that was existing in Iran in the months before the coup, so that Iranian civilians and military personnel would increasingly get the impression that Mossadegh was losing control of the situation. So manipulating the environment in the weeks leading up to the coup to try to turn people against Mossadegh. So that was first component of the plan. Secondly, and very interestingly, there was the core of the initial coup plan was to create a political crisis in Tehran, which would then become a pretext for Parliament to dismiss Mossadegh as prime minister. Creating the political crisis was to be done by religious leaders, a combination of religious leaders and the American and British covert intelligence agents in Iran. They would create a crisis, and then Parliament, whose members would have been bought off by that time with huge amounts of CIA money. CIA dedicated $10,000 a week, which is a huge amount of money in Iran at that time, to buying off members of Parliament. There were only, I think, 79 members of Parliament at the time. So you can do the math and figure out how rich members of Parliament were getting with this CIA money. So CIA was buying off members of Parliament toward the goal of having them vote to dismiss Mossadegh once this manufactured political crisis had come to a head. So that was to be really kind of the core of the coup plan, and in the Wilbur report they call this a quasi-legal effort to overthrow Mossadegh. Quasi-legal in the sense that it was legal for Parliament to vote to dismiss him, but of course they were doing it because they had been bribed and manipulated by the CIA and its allies. Third key part of the coup plan was to organize a military network, which would be a backup facility in case this manufactured political crisis did not come to pass, and of course it did not. Then there would simply be a military coup. And so the CIA, first of all, chose Fazlollah Zahedi to be the replacement for Mossadegh. He was not chosen by the Shah, certainly not chosen by the Iranian people. He was chosen by the CIA in consultation with the British. They chose him because they figured he would be a good person to organize the military network. So he would organize a network of military officers who would be prepared to carry out a military coup in case the manufactured political crisis did not come to pass. And I'll come back to this military network in a minute. Another key element, then the CIA, or the Americans in general, would persuade the Shah to back the coup. They realized, even at this planning stage in May 1953, that it would not be easy to persuade the Shah. He was very indecisive. He was still a young man at this time. He certainly understood that Mossadegh was popular. It would not be an easy thing for him at all to dismiss the Shah. So they planned that, it would be very important to have the Shah's backing for this coup, and they planned various ways to persuade the Shah to back the coup. Finally, as part of this initial planning stage, Wilbur and Derbyshire began to draw up a list of Iranians who would be arrested when the coup took place. These would be, of course, key National Front leaders, key Tudeh Party leaders, and other such people. So this was to be, of course, a very serious coup plot. They wanted to not just get Mossadegh out of power, but really take care of the situation. So this was the initial plan, but gradually it fell apart and was revised in various ways. Two main problems emerged. First of all, the clerical leaders, who were evidently Ayatollah Behbahani, Ayatollah Kashani, Ayatollah Borujerdi, and Nawab Safavi, the head of Fedayeen Islam, they were apparently the clerical leaders who were to be involved in this, but they evidently got cold feet, did not want to participate in the coup plot after a while. So this whole plan of manufacturing a political crisis that would then trigger a parliamentary vote against Mossadegh basically fell apart, and they had to drop that from the plan. Secondly, Mossadegh in late July got wind of the external efforts to buy off members of Parliament and denounced this, openly, saying foreigners are trying to corrupt the Parliament, something like that. And so he then staged a referendum about 2.5 weeks before the coup finally occurred, closing down Parliament. And so Parliament then could not vote to dismiss Mossadegh. So, you know, again, that had been part of the original plan. A huge amount of money was allocated to buy off members of Parliament. Mossadegh got wind of it, closed Parliament for that reason, and therefore that was not possible. So much of the initial coup plan then did not come to pass because of the way events transpired. So planning the coup was the second major set of actions CIA took. Thirdly, in the middle part of July 1953, when Kermit Roosevelt, the CIA senior official who led the coup, and another CIA officer named George Carroll, who is what we would call today a paramilitary officer, was fresh from Korea, where he'd been doing all kinds of nasty things apparently in Korea, and certainly was a World War II veteran. Roosevelt and Carroll went out to Iran from Washington in the latter part of July. Carroll with the intention of seeing where the military network was at, that Zahedi supposedly was organizing it, and making sure that it was going in the right direction. Well, when Carroll got out to Iran around July 20th, something like that, and went to see Zahedi, he found out that Zahedi had done nothing to organize this military coup. Zahedi had been given $135,000 by the CIA station and evidently had put it in his pocket and had not used it to organize this network and had no military network. Furthermore, he had very few contacts at all among active duty military officers. Zahedi had been retired from the military for a while, and Mossadegh had been replacing senior officers, and so Zahedi's contacts were stale. And so Zahedi really did not have the capability to organize the military network. And so Carroll largely organized the military network, working in conjunction with another Iranian named Abbas Farzanaghan. Farzanaghan was a colonel in the Air Force, and he was at this time a military attaché in the Iranian embassy in Washington. And in Washington, the CIA had hired him to be a translator for the TPB Dam project, because after all, none of the Americans could speak Persian, let alone write Persian at this time. So Farzanaghan was in Washington, but on the CIA payroll. And so when Carroll realized that there was no military network, Farzanaghan was brought out to Tehran because he had contacts among the military officers. And so Carroll and Farzanaghan then organized the military network in the weeks prior to the coup. Carroll also, on his way out to Iran, stopped off in London and worked with MI6 to work out plans for a military coup, because of course when military forces carry out a coup, they don't just go out in the street with no plans and roll the tanks out in the street. They have to make decisions about which units will take which locations, in what sequence, code words, all these kinds of things. You have to organize something like that. You don't just drive out of the barracks. And so the plan for the coup was worked out by Carroll in conjunction with British intelligence officers. So these two things, organizing the military network and working out the plans for the military coup, were crucially important. I would say probably the most important things that the CIA did in overthrowing Mossadegh. Because after all, this was essentially a military coup. It wasn't crowds of civilians who took key locations throughout Tehran. Civilians can't really do that. It was military units that took Mossadegh's house, took over army headquarters, took over the radio station, and other key locations like that. So the military network and the military plans that were made by the CIA were crucial. Fourth step the CIA took was to orchestrate this elaborate effort, and I guess you could almost call it a comical effort if it wasn't such a deadly serious issue, to persuade the Shah to cooperate with this plot. And I'm not going to go into the details, but there were a whole series of emissaries, both Americans and Iranians, who were sent to see the Shah over a period of about 3 weeks. This was a total of at least a half dozen meetings with the Shah. And only after a long time, and only after basically Kermit Roosevelt threatened the Shah in various ways, did the Shah finally agree to back the coup. The Shah was definitely reluctant about this. Of course, his backing for the coup was crucially important. I mean, not to say the coup couldn't have worked without it, but certainly it was an important part of this, because he then signed royal decrees dismissing Mossadegh, appointing Zahedi. These decrees were circulated in the few days of the coup and played an important role in persuading people who were sitting on the fence, both military personnel and civilians, to back the coup. So getting the Shah into the coup plot was crucial, and this was orchestrated by the CIA. Fifth, then, the CIA orchestrated the initial coup attempt, which took place on the night of August 15th and 16th. This was the initial military plan. A group of anti-Mossadegh officers would go to Mossadegh's house, present him with the decree from the Shah dismissing him, and presumably arrest him if that was necessary. Mossadegh had learned about this, and so Mossadegh had loyalist units that arrested that team. So the initial coup plot fell apart on the night of August 15th and 16th, and then pro-Mossadegh military units the next morning began to arrest various participants in the coup plot, and arrested, a number of the key figures, especially key military officers. So that was the fifth key step. Sixth, then the CIA orchestrated a second coup attempt, which finally took place on the morning, or during the day of August 19th, and this one was successful. This was basically improvised. When I interviewed Kermit Roosevelt about the coup back in the mid-1980s, he kind of chuckled and said, yeah, we had this initial coup plan that had been drawn up in Nicosia, but I knew all along that we were going to have to improvise because things never really go according to plan. So he told me he expected to improvise, and that's exactly what they began to do after the first plot fell apart. What they had under their belts, which turned out to be invaluable, were all kinds of preparations that they had made prior to the initial coup plot. So they already had millions of dollars in CIA safes in the US Embassy. They had CIA safe houses, other kinds of physical assets in Tehran. They had the military network, which was still largely intact, although a few key people had been arrested. They had plans for what locations the military network would take at what times. They had the royal decrees, which they had gotten the Shah to sign. And they had the covert action capabilities of the TPB-DAM network, and also the British network run by the Rashidian brothers, which was the British counterpart to the TPB-DAM network, which had been turned over to the Americans in the meeting in Cyprus in May. So Roosevelt then improvised the second coup attempt, but using all these capabilities that the CIA had been carefully setting up in the previous months and years. This improvisation did several things which were crucial to the success of the second coup attempt. First of all, the CIA hid Fazlollah Zahedi, the chosen successor to Mossadegh. If he had been arrested, the second coup attempt never would have occurred because, he was the nominal head of it. They hid Zahedi initially in the US Embassy, and then eventually he was hidden in the basement of one of the 5 CIA officers who carried out the coup. That CIA officer told me that police, presumably police loyal to Mossadegh, were very close to finding Zahedi. They had identified the specific neighborhood in Tehran where the CIA officer's house was, and the officer told me there was even a police officer up a telephone pole across the street watching what was going on in the compound to see if Zahedi was there. He told me that he figured the police were within half an hour of arresting Zahedi. In any case, the CIA's hiding of Zahedi was crucially important. Second, the CIA publicized the royal decrees. They copied them out on, predecessor to a modern photocopy machine, and then circulated them in various ways, and in the following days widely publicized the fact that the Shah had dismissed Mossadegh and appointed Zahedi. This was crucially important because a lot of Iranians very much respected the monarchy. If the Shah did it at this time, lots of people, including especially a lot of military personnel, would be very much swayed by the Shah's support for the dismissal of Mossadegh. Thirdly, and this is one of the issues that I'm not entirely clear on, during this period between the two coups, the CIA team used their TPB-DAN network to set up what we can call fake Tudeh-party crowds, provocations, sending crowds out into the streets using their TPB-DAN political action capabilities that would pretend to be Tudeh-party crowds and do things that would sort of stir up trouble and create chaos. In other words, the CIA people acting as agents provocateurs to try to stir up a crisis in Tehran. And they did that. To what extent they created the crisis that emerged is not clear, but certainly on the 17th and 18th of August, in the days between the first and second coup attempts, large Tudeh-party crowds were out in the street, tearing down statues, attacking various buildings, creating chaos, and undoubtedly turning a lot of Iranians, again, particularly military personnel, against Mossadegh. But how extensive that was, I don't really know. Maybe Masiar Behruz will talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. Finally, the CIA team met with Zahedi and with the Rashidians and decided to launch a second coup attempt on August 19th. This meeting took place in the evening of August 17th. And they made plans to take several steps that they hoped would catalyze a second coup attempt. One was they tried to approach Ayatollah Borujerdi, who was the leading Shia cleric of the era, and try to get him to call for what they called a holy war against communism. That never happened. They sent some of their people out to some of the outlying garrisons in Isfahan and in Kermanshah to try to persuade those military units to come to Tehran. The Kermanshah unit agreed, the Isfahan unit refused to participate in the coup. They made various plans to organize civilian crowds that would come out on the morning of August 19th in the hope that this would help catalyze a coup, that this would stiffen the backbone of the military units. They gave some money to an intermediary to give to Ayatollah Kashani to do this. It's not clear whether that money ever got to Kashani and whether he played a role. They apparently gave money to Ayatollah Behbahani to do this, and undoubtedly others as well. And then finally, they had the military network start to carry out activities. This began in the evening of August 18th, the day before the coup. The military came out into the streets and began breaking up the Tudeh crowds and exerting control. And that continued the next morning. By the middle of the morning, by 10:30 or so in the morning of August 19th, the military had largely seized control over Tehran, and pretty much Mossadegh's fate was sealed at that point. Finally, it's worth mentioning that, of course, the dismissal of Mossadegh was not the end of the story. If that had been the end, Iranian politics could have evolved in various different ways. After the coup, there were various things that the new Zahedi government did, some of them with assistance from the CIA and other branches of the US government, that helped solidify what had been achieved with the overthrow of Mossadegh. So the arrest lists that the CIA had drawn up were implemented, and something like 2,100 people were arrested between August 19th and the end of the calendar year, December 1953. So the CIA played a role in carrying out the arrests, guiding the arrests that took place. Qashqai tribal units, which were aligned with Mossadegh, apparently for a while after the coup were thinking about marching on Tehran or causing trouble. CIA station chief Joseph Goodwin, who knew the Qashqai tribal chiefs, went down to their region and talked them out of doing it. CIA station gave Zahedi $1 million or so after the coup, presumably to use for various things, Some of the CIA people speculated that he used it to build his villa in Switzerland that his son now lives in. They used the propaganda capabilities of TPB-DAM after the coup, continued to use them to try to strengthen public support, to drive public opinion in favor of Zahedi and the Shah. Gradually, in the next few years after the coup, they turned over these propaganda capabilities to the appropriate Iranian ministries, Ministry of Propaganda or whatever it's called, Ministry of Press, and that kind of place. CIA played a minor role in the rigging of the parliamentary elections in, I believe it was March 1954, not a major role. Finally, the most important thing the CIA did after the coup that had a very important long-term impact on Iran was 3 weeks after the coup, they sent a U.S. Army colonel who had been doing various jobs for them out to Tehran to organize a new intelligence branch that eventually became SAVAK. This Army colonel worked with Temur Bakhtiar, who was the military governor of Tehran, to organize a new modern intelligence unit. This grew in the following months and years. The key indication that this new intelligence unit was effective came about a year after the coup, when this unit, with very little help from the United States, broke up the Tudeh military organization that Erband was talking about earlier today. And so this nucleus that became SAVAK was another major contribution by CIA immediately after the coup. Finally, I'm running over, and probably Michael's going to start really getting mad at me. Let me just briefly mention a few other things that other branches of the U.S. government did. The United States did, in some fairly important ways, support the British oil boycott, not for the purpose of undermining Iran, but for the purpose of keeping oil prices low in the United States. In the couple of months leading up to the coup, the State Department took a few actions to sort of snub and discredit, or now we would say diss, Mossadegh, which probably had a little bit of an impact. Another important event, Ambassador Henderson met with Mossadegh the day before the coup and seems to have helped persuade him to pull his people off the street and let the military come out into the street. I think probably the most important, well, and then another thing, after the coup, the U.S. gave Iran $68 million in foreign aid within a few weeks of the coup. This amounted to about a third of the revenue that Iran lost from the oil boycott. So a big infusion of money came into Iran about 3 weeks after the coup. This certainly very much helped stabilize the post-coup situation. And then finally, of course, the U.S. played a key role in negotiating a new oil agreement under which Iran in 55, 56, 57, 58 began getting more and more amounts of oil revenue. By the late 50s, Iran was getting huge amounts of oil revenue, and of course in the 60s and early and mid 70s, Iran's economy was booming at a rate roughly comparable to that of China in the last few decades. This was made possible by the oil agreement that the State Department negotiated. So it was not just the CIA, and it certainly was not just the